When a narcissistic individual pulls away after hurting you, they may say something like, "I'm sorry, I'm feeling overwhelmed," or "I need some space, I'm not feeling okay." The instinct is to interpret that distance as proof of indifference, as if their silence confirms they never truly cared. But that interpretation, while understandable, often misses something far more complex and, in many ways, more unsettling. The distance is not always about a lack of feeling. In many cases, it is about the presence of feeling that they simply do not know how to face. What we're really looking at here is the psychology of shame. Not guilt in the mature sense, the kind that says, "I've done something wrong, and I need to make it right." That requires a stable sense of self, a capacity for reflection, and the ability to tolerate emotional discomfort. Shame is different. Shame says, "There is something wrong with me." It is global, overwhelming, and deeply threatening to the psyche. For someone organized around narcissistic defenses, shame is not just painful, it is annihilating. So when they hurt you, especially if you genuinely matter to them, they are confronted, whether consciously or unconsciously, with a version of themselves they cannot bear to see. Not because they don't recognize the harm, but because recognizing it would collapse the fragile structure they've built to survive. Their identity often depends on maintaining a sense of superiority, control, or emotional invulnerability. To fully acknowledge that they've caused pain to someone who loved them would puncture that illusion. And so, rather than moving toward repair, they move toward distance. This is where it becomes confusing, even contradictory. Because from the outside, distance looks like rejection. It feels like abandonment. You might think if they cared, they would come back, apologize, explain, do something. But you're applying a framework of emotional capacity that they may not possess. Their withdrawal is not a strategic punishment, at least not primarily. It's a psychological escape, a retreat from an internal experience that feels too threatening to endure. In a way, your pain becomes a mirror. And instead of looking into that mirror and confronting what it reflects, they turn away from it entirely. Not because the reflection is untrue, but because it is too true. There's also a profound fear embedded in this dynamic, the fear that if they come closer, they will have to feel what they've spent a lifetime avoiding. The grief, the inadequacy, the vulnerability that sits beneath the surface. Your presence, especially if you offer genuine care, has the potential to expose those layers. And after causing harm, that exposure becomes even more intense. So distance becomes a form of emotional anesthesia. But here's the difficult part to accept. Their inability to face their shame does not reduce the impact of their actions on you. Understanding the mechanism is not the same as excusing the behavior. You can recognize that their withdrawal is rooted in psychological limitation, while also acknowledging the real hurt it has caused. And perhaps this is where a deeper clarity begins to emerge. The distance is not necessarily a reflection of your worth, nor is it a reliable measure of their feelings. It is a reflection of their capacity, or lack of it, to sit with themselves in truth. So when someone steps away after hurting you, don't rush to interpret their silence as a simple message. It is often a complicated one, shaped by fear, shame, and emotional fragility. And in that complexity lies a hard but liberating realization. Sometimes, the distance you feel is not about how little they care, but about how little they can bear to understand themselves. And until a person can face themselves, they will not be able to achieve their goals. They will always remain distant from others, no matter how much they may long to be close. If we stay with this idea of distance, not as indifference, but as a kind of protection, we begin to see another layer of the dynamic, one that is even more paradoxical. Because the same person who pulls away from you may, at the very same time, feel a genuine pull toward you. And this is where people get confused. They think it must be one or the other. They either care or they don't. But psychologically, it is very often both. At the core of narcissistic patterns, there is a profound attachment hunger. This is not something superficial or manipulative by design. It is rooted in early developmental experiences where connection was inconsistent, conditional, or unsafe. The child learns, on the one hand, that they need closeness in order to survive emotionally. But on the other hand, they also learn that closeness comes with risk, rejection, disappointment, even a loss of self. And so, the very thing they long for becomes the very thing they fear. That conflict doesn't disappear in adulthood. It simply becomes more sophisticated. So when they meet someone who offers genuine presence, someone who sees them, who cares, who perhaps even touches those deeper unmet needs, it activates both sides of that early conditioning. There is a movement toward you, a desire for connection, for validation, even for love. But almost simultaneously, there is a counter movement away from you, driven by a fear that intimacy will expose something unbearable. And when harm enters the relationship, when they hurt you, that inner conflict intensifies. Because now, closeness would require not just vulnerability, but accountability. It would require them to remain present in the face of your pain, to acknowledge their role in it, and to tolerate the emotional consequences of that recognition. For someone whose system is organized around avoiding vulnerability, that is an enormous demand. So they oscillate. Internally, there is a longing to repair, to reconnect, to reestablish the bond. But there is also a powerful impulse to withdraw, to shut down, to regain a sense of control. And often, the withdrawal wins not because the longing is absent, but because the fear is stronger. From the outside, this can feel like inconsistency, even manipulation. One moment, there is warmth or closeness; the next, there is distance or silence. But if we look beneath the behavior, what we see is not a calculated strategy, but a nervous system caught in contradiction. A system that has never learned how to feel safe in connection. And this is important because it shifts the question. Instead of asking, "Why are they doing this to me?" we begin to ask, "What is happening within them?" That makes closeness so difficult to sustain. That doesn't make the experience any less painful, but it does bring a kind of clarity. It removes the illusion that if you just did something differently, if you were more patient, more understanding, more accommodating, you could resolve the tension. You can't resolve a conflict that lives inside someone else. What you're witnessing is an unresolved relationship between their need for attachment and their fear of it. And until that relationship is addressed consciously through awareness, through healing, through a willingness to tolerate vulnerability, it will continue to play out in the same way. Not just with you, but with anyone who comes close enough to matter. So the distance you experience is not simply about you. It is the outward expression of an inward struggle, one that has likely been there long before you entered the picture. And perhaps the most difficult truth in all of this is that you cannot win against someone's fear of intimacy. No amount of care can override a defense that was built for survival. Because in the end, a person will always retreat from the very connection they crave if that connection requires them to face what they are not yet ready to feel. If we continue to follow this thread, we arrive at something that is often misunderstood, and at times, deeply frustrating to witness. What appears as calculated control or cold withdrawal is, in many cases, a reflection of emotional immaturity, not immaturity in the sense of intelligence or capability in the outer world. Many of these individuals are highly functional, even impressive, but immaturity in their inner emotional landscape. When a psychologically mature person recognizes that they have caused harm, there is a sequence that can unfold. There is discomfort, certainly. There may be guilt, regret, even grief. But alongside that, there is an ability to remain present, to say, "Yes, I did this. I can face it. I can stay in the room, internally and externally, and take responsibility." That capacity doesn't emerge automatically. It develops in environments where emotions were acknowledged, where repair was modeled, where the individual learned that making a mistake did not mean losing connection. For someone organized around narcissistic defenses, that developmental process is often interrupted. Instead of learning how to process difficult emotions, they learn how to avoid them. Instead of integrating experiences of failure or harm into a stable sense of self, they split them off, deny them, or project them outward. And over time, these strategies become automatic. So when they hurt you, what is required in that moment, emotionally speaking, is far beyond what their system knows how to do. It's not simply about saying, "I'm sorry." It's about tolerating the internal experience that comes with that recognition. The discomfort of seeing themselves as the source of pain. The vulnerability of acknowledging imperfection. The fear that if they fully admit fault, they will lose their sense of worth or control. And because they lack the tools to navigate that experience, they default to what has always worked for them: distance. From the outside, this can look deliberate. It can feel like they are choosing to ignore you, to shut you out, to maintain power by withholding. And while there may be elements of control in the behavior, The deeper driver is not master I, it's avoidance. It's the absence of an internal capacity to regulate and process what has been activated. In that sense, their withdrawal is less a strategy and more a limitation. This is where it becomes important to separate impact from intent. The impact of their behavior can be deeply painful. Being met with silence or distance after you've been hurt can intensify the wound. It can create confusion, self-doubt, even a sense of abandonment, and none of that should be minimized. But understanding the limitation behind the behavior allows you to see it more clearly. You're not dealing with someone who is fully equipped to engage in mutual emotional accountability. You're dealing with someone whose inner development in this area has been stunted, who is responding not from a place of grounded awareness, but from a place of learned defense. And that distinction matters, because it shifts where you place your expectations. If you expect emotional maturity from someone who has not developed it, you will remain caught in a cycle of disappointment. You will continue to interpret their withdrawal as a choice they could easily reverse, rather than as a reflection of something they do not yet have access to. This doesn't mean they are incapable of growth, but growth requires awareness, willingness, and often a level of support or guidance that they may not seek on their own. Until that happens, their patterns will remain consistent, no matter how much the external circumstances change. So what you see as control may actually be a lack of control over their own internal world. What feels like rejection may actually be an inability to stay emotionally present. And perhaps the most sobering realization is this: you cannot have a mature, accountable relationship with someone who has not yet learned how to be accountable to themselves. If we take this one step deeper, we begin to see that the moment they hurt you is not just a relational event, it is also a psychological trigger. Something is activated within them that often has very little to do with the present moment, and everything to do with what has never been resolved in their past. When someone carries unprocessed emotional wounds, those wounds don't remain dormant. They live just beneath the surface, shaping perception, influencing reactions, quietly organizing behavior. And relationships, especially intimate ones, have a way of bringing those wounds to the surface, not because something is going wrong, but because closeness has a unique capacity to expose what has been hidden. So when they hurt you and then become aware, at least on some level, of the impact of that hurt, it doesn't simply register as, "I've made a mistake." It resonates much more deeply. It touches an older narrative, one that may have been formed in early experiences of rejection, neglect, or conditional acceptance. In that moment, your pain becomes intertwined with their own unresolved pain. But here's the crucial point. They don't experience this consciously as a connection to the past. They experience it as an overwhelming emotional state in the present, one that feels confusing, disorganizing, and often intolerable. And because they have not developed the capacity to sit with that kind of internal activation, they move away from it. Distance, then, is not just about avoiding you. It is about avoiding what you represent in that moment. You become, unintentionally, a doorway to feelings they have spent a lifetime trying not to feel. Feelings of inadequacy, of not being enough, of being exposed or rejected. And rather than stepping through that doorway and engaging with those emotions, they close it. This is why attempts to repair the relationship can sometimes be met with further withdrawal. From your perspective, you may be offering understanding, openness, even compassion. But from their internal perspective, the situation is already charged. Your presence, even if it is kind, keeps the emotional activation alive. It keeps them connected to something they are not prepared to process. So they disengage. Not because your approach is wrong, but because the internal experience it evokes is too much for them to manage. And this is where the dynamic becomes particularly painful, because it creates a kind of inversion of reality. The person who was hurt becomes the one left without closure, while the person who caused the hurt distances themselves from the very experience that could lead to accountability and repair. It can feel unjust, even disorienting. But if we look at it through the lens of unresolved trauma, a different picture emerges. We begin to see that their behavior is not just reactive, it is protective. It is an attempt, however maladaptive, to regulate an internal state that feels overwhelming and unsafe. Of course, protection that comes at the expense of another person's well-being is not healthy protection. It perpetuates harm rather than resolving it, but understanding its origin helps us avoid personalizing it in ways that deepen our own suffering. You are not the cause of their withdrawal. You are the context in which something much older has been activated. And until that older material is acknowledged and worked through, it will continue to shape their responses not just with you, but in any relationship that reaches a level of emotional significance. So what you're encountering is not simply a reaction to a moment. It is the echo of a history that has not yet been integrated. And perhaps the most difficult truth in this is that you cannot heal what was wounded long before you arrived. Because when the past remains unresolved, it doesn't stay in the past, it quietly takes control of the present. And when we bring all of this together, the shame they cannot face, the internal conflict between longing and fear, the emotional immaturity that limits their response, and the unresolved wounds that get activated, we arrive at perhaps the most difficult and clarifying point of all, the gap between what they feel and what they are actually capable of doing. Because it is entirely possible, more common than people realize, that they do want connection, that they do feel something real, that on some level they recognize the loss, the distance, even the damage. But wanting something emotionally is not the same as having the capacity to sustain it in reality. This is where many people become stuck. They sense the underlying feeling in the other person. They pick up on the moments of warmth, the glimpses of sincerity, the subtle indications that something meaningful exists beneath the surface. And they hold on to that. They think, if it's there, then it can be built on. If they feel it, then eventually they'll act on it. But that assumption overlooks a crucial truth about human psychology. Capacity is not determined by desire. It is determined by development. You can want closeness and still be unable to tolerate intimacy. You can want to repair and still be unable to take responsibility. You can even want to love and yet repeatedly behave in ways that undermine connection. Not because the desire is false, but because the internal structure required to support that desire has not been formed. And so, what you often see is a pattern that feels contradictory. There may be moments where they move toward you subtly, indirectly, sometimes even intensely, and then, just as quickly, they retreat again. Not because the feeling disappeared, but because staying would require something they cannot yet access within themselves. This creates a painful illusion for the person on the receiving end. It suggests potential. It suggests that something real is trying to emerge. And in a sense, that's true. But potential, on its own, is not a relationship. It is only the possibility of one. A relationship requires consistency, accountability, and the ability to remain present even when things become uncomfortable. Without those elements, what exists is not a stable connection, but a cycle, one that can feel deeply meaningful at times and deeply destabilizing at others. And this is where clarity becomes essential. Not clarity about what they feel, but clarity about what they are able to do with what they feel. Because if you base your decisions on their intentions, you will remain caught in ambiguity. But if you base them on their demonstrated capacity, the picture becomes much clearer. You begin to see not just who they could be under ideal circumstances, but who they are in reality, given their current level of awareness and development. This is not about judgment. It is about recognition. People can only meet others as deeply as they have met themselves. And if they have not yet developed the ability to face their own pain, their own responsibility, their own vulnerability, then their relationships will inevitably reflect that limitation. So the question is not whether they want closeness. In many cases they do. The question is whether they have done the internal work required to sustain it. And until that work is done, the gap between desire and action will remain. And that gap is where confusion lives, where hope gets tangled with reality, and where many people lose themselves trying to bridge something that is not theirs to fix. Because in the end, no matter how real the feeling may be, a relationship can only exist at the level of what someone is able to live, not at the level of what they wish were true.